Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. We're here today with our good friend, Brian McLaren. Today, we're going to talk about one of Brian's less well-known books, but I would say one of the very important ones. It's called The Seventh Story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence, that he wrote with Gareth Higgins. There's also a similar children's book, Corey and the Seventh Story, that they also wrote. It's, basically in the same theme. The reason why I wanted to interview Brian about this was because I heard him talk about it at the Wild Goose Festival. And it was just so compelling that, I really wanted to invite him to talk about it here and to, have a little bit of a discussion about it. So as you all probably know, Brian is an author, speaker, activist, public theologian, former college English teacher and pastor. He's a passionate advocate of a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for the common good. He's a core faculty member and dean of faculty at the Center for Action and Contemplation and a podcaster with Learning How to See. He's also an Auburn Senior Fellow and a co-host of Southern Lights. His newest books are Faith After Doubt, Do I Stay Christian, and Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. And I think we've interviewed Brian for all of those. So if you go to one of our websites, you can find the interviews for all of those amazing books as well. In any event, Brian graduated from the University of Maryland with degrees in English and has been awarded a Doctor of Divinity from Carey Theological Seminary and a second honorary doctorate from Virginia Theological Seminary. So you can learn about all of Brian's work at brianmclaren.net. So Brian, it's always wonderful to speak with you. Many congratulations on all of your amazing work, and thanks so much for spending some time with us.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Brian. I'm always intrigued and impressed by all the good things that you're sparking all over the place. So thanks for the way you support so many writers and encourage so many people.
Well, it's a blessing for me. I mean, to be able to work with so many amazing writers in particular has just been an incredible gift that I've enjoyed and appreciate immensely. So it's wonderful to do that with you too, because you have introduced me to so many people, first of all, and also you're just so gracious with your time and with your network and, all the ways that you connect people. So that is something that can't go overappreciated.
Well, thanks.
So before we discuss Seventh Story, though, I mean, you just released Life After Doom. So I guess I should give you a chance to, briefly tell folks about that.
Yes. Well, the response has been very, very moving. I suppose the people I most wanted to help with this book were people who already care about climate change and ecological overshoot and other social justice issues like economic inequality and political corruption and political division. And because so many people, and I know this because I'm one of them, who care about these issues, reach points where they're motivated because they think if we just do this, if we just win this, if we just fix this, we'll get there and we'll solve the problem. And that motivation carries us for a long way. But a lot of us are reaching the end of that motivation. And we realize, gosh, we said we have to act now or we have to act soon. And now has passed and soon has passed. And we keep seeing breakthroughs in one area and setbacks in another area. And very often the technology is encouraging. Sometimes the business side of it is encouraging, but then scientists come and tell us, whoops, things were a little worse than we realized. So you put all that together and a lot of people are feeling a sense of doom, which I define as the sense that our problems are way bigger than our solutions and our current capacities to solve them. And so what I've heard from people in the activist community is a lot of thanks. A lot of people have said they felt relief reading the book because it felt like at last some other people are taking our situation as seriously as these readers had been, and felt that others weren't really seeing what they were seeing. I've had a lot of other people who told me reading the book, especially, the first 4 or 5 chapters was pretty disturbing and unsettling. And because they hadn't been super familiar with kind of the current science and especially they maybe hadn't been informed about kind of the interplay and interconnection of so many of our current challenges and struggles. And so those folks have told me it was challenging. And then what really has encouraged me is they say by the time they got to the end of the book, it was worth it. So it might not have gone the way. I know I've read books where I got partway through and then decided it wasn't worth it. But so those have been encouraging. It's been super encouraging to hear from a lot of scientists who say, wow, you really nailed the science. So all of that has been encouraging. Of course, the ultimate encouragement is to see us continue to make progress in the issues that we need to make progress in. And I suppose all of us between now and November are going to wonder how our elections are going to go here in the United States. Are we going to elect more people who are in denial about our current situation or more people who are trying to take it seriously? And of course, that's going on around the world. I understand this year, more people are voting for national leadership than at any other single year in history. So,
right. Wow.
So this is a very significant year. And I hope at the end of the year, we'll say we're making progress in those areas.
Well, as I've told you before, first of all, I hope your book is too pessimistic. I fear that it's not, but I hope that it is.
I feel the same way.
Secondly, I hope it does spur more action and more awareness, of the gravity of the situation and, pushes a wider set of folks to,
Yes.
Move to do things about it. So,
Yes.
The only time will tell, right? And
only time will tell.
Right. It'll be gray, just like everything else, right? It's
That's
not black
right.
and white.
Right. Back when I was a preacher, Brian, I remember I preached a sermon on Jonah as an example of a prophet. I think Jonah is probably a fictional character, but it's telling a very true story. And I remember when I preached that sermon, I said to people, prophets give warnings hoping they will be wrong.
Yeah.
Because they give warnings to tell people, if you keep going in this situation, these will be the consequences. And so their goal is to say, that word repent means to turn in a different direction. So, yeah.
Well, good analogy. I mean, I think this is exactly that type of situation. So if you do want to see the interview to Life After Doom that Brian and I did together, just go to the Faith and Justice book group website and you can find it there. So let's get into the new book, and it's not brand new, but The Seventh Story that you wrote with Gareth Higgins. How did that book happen?
Well, Gareth and I have been friends for many years. He was actually the leader of the Wild Goose Festival for many years, and he and I had been friends many years before that. Gareth had been deeply involved in the peace process during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And he grew up in Northern Ireland as a Protestant. And he, obviously his life, his family was touched deeply by all of the violence and trauma of that time. So he became interested and called toward peacemaking. And he and I had met in that context. And I was visiting him some years ago, and I can't remember if he had heard me talk about the 7 stories or he and his husband and I were just sitting at dinner and I ran through the 7 stories with him. I think he had already read about it. And he said at some point told me that the 7 stories had helped him reconnect with his Christian faith because he'd felt very disillusioned with so much of the Christian, activities of the Christian religion. But the way I explained the 7 stories, he said it sort of recarbonated his own faith. And so he then just started saying to me, you really should do something with this. And I said, well, I've done with it what I think I can. And he said, well, how about we try something together? And so that led to the children's book and then the collection of adult essays.
Well, it's a little bit about me pushing you to write the book that you did the ebook on about bias
Yes, that's right.
and
That's
all the
right.
forms of biases. So I'm glad you pay attention to us needlers, that are pushing you to
Well,
do things that you don't have time to do.
and I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for friends like you as well. That's right.
So, you've told the stories, several times, and I was really floored by it when I heard it, at Wild Goose, because I'd never really heard the encapsulation
Yes,
of this previously too. So could you go through that for folks
I
so
would
they
love
have an
to.
understanding of what you mean by the seven stories?
Yeah, so let me go through the seven stories and share the story of how I stumbled into this.
Okay, good.
Um, Back in my years as a preacher, uh, I went through a theological turn where I thought, I mean, this is sort of obvious, but I thought, gosh, I'm a Christian. I had to pay more attention to Jesus. so, so I spent a lot of time preaching from the Gospels, a much larger percentage of the time than I had up till that point, focusing on the life and teaching of Jesus. And I realized that so much of my theology had been shaped by Paul and by the Hebrew scriptures, but interestingly, Jesus was important for other reasons, but not for what he said and taught. And so as I paid more attention to Jesus, my background as an English teacher, sort of an English major in university, kind of came back, and I said, if I were just looking at this as a story, if Jesus is the protagonist, there are a number of key antagonists. And I wanted to start getting a sense of where the points of conflict were.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I started to realize is that uh, in the backdrop of the stories of Jesus, there are these movements. And we might even call them today political parties. But one of the most powerful, it was not the first one I thought about. It is so obvious, but it was so easy for me to miss it, I think for a lot of people too, because the way we were taught to read the Bible. The first was the Romans. And the Romans are in the backdrop of everything in the Gospels. They are the occupying power. They are the oppressive empire, and the Jewish people are the oppressed, controlled people in that time. And and uh, and among Jesus' contemporaries, there was a group of people who really felt this is a good deal with the Romans. We're making a lot of money. This is going well. They called themselves the Herodians. And then there was another group called the Sadducees who were also doing very well. And they and the Herodians tended to be friendly as saying, look, the Romans are in power. We should just make them all the money we can, try to get along the way we can, and stop complaining and fighting it. Uh, well, that made me think, what really is the story of the Romans and those who go along with an imperial power? And obviously, it's the story of domination. I mean, we call them uh, kingdoms or empires or dominions. They're places where one great, powerful leader, almost always a man, dominates everyone else, and they create a pyramid of deference where people gain safety and security and protection by deferring to the will of the emperor. And the idea that disseminates in a domination story is that the only way to peace is if we all submit to a powerful strongman or leader. Interestingly, there's a resurgence of interest and affinity for that domination story. It's also the story that goes behind things like white supremacy. Whenever you hear a word supremacy, Christian supremacy, Hindu supremacy, Jewish supremacy, Muslim supremacy, these are clues that the domination story is going on. It's super powerful story. I remember, gosh, I was like in my 40s before I realized that when I learned the word explorers for North America exploration, they were the same thing as conquistadors in South American exploration. And I realized that really they were just Northern European conquistadors
I never
moving
thought of that
across.
either, but yeah, exactly.
And,
Completely
and
different
so
words, right?
exactly. And words like manifest destiny and
Mm,
American exceptionalism are ways of people saying we still like the domination story that was part of our past. It's still
yes.
very popular. Um, of course, wherever you have a domination story, then you have a revolution story, people wanting to overthrow those in power. And in the Gospels, that's the zealots. And of course, Jesus interestingly chooses a zealot as one of his followers, Simon. He's known as Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots, we know a lot about them from Josephus and other ancient historians. Um, but their idea was, in fact, they were connected with a group called the Sicarii. The Sicarii is a curved knife with the
Mm,
sharp blade on the inside curve, and you would wear this under your clothes. And the idea, they're what we would call terrorists.
mm,
The Sicarii would say, "Oh, if you see a Roman soldier urinating against a wall and nobody's around, pull out your knife, which it would sort of your membership card, and sneak up behind the Roman soldier and just take the knife and slit his neck." The idea was just start engaging in violent resistance against the Romans. And there was a religious dimension. If enough of us do this, God will send us a leader, a Messiah, who
mm.
will lead us in battle and will overthrow the Romans. And so the Zealots were very, very powerful. And in fact, they launched a successful revolution against the Romans in AD 67 that is super important in understanding the New Testament, although most Christians have never even heard of it.
Yeah, really.
And for almost 3 years, they managed to keep the Romans out. But then the Romans came back and crushed them,
Mm,
and not one stone was left on another.
mm.
It was mass extinction of so many of the Jewish people. And so domination, revolution, those two stories account for an awful lot of the headlines that we ever read. What happens when your group is in power and things are still not going well? Well, when that happens, you need someone to blame for your problems. It might be a group of people who exist. If they exist, they need to be small in number, because if they were powerful and if they were large in number, they could strike back. You pick a minority group who you can blame for your problems. And this is called scapegoating. And I call this the third narrative, the purification narrative. This
Mhm.
is the narrative that says all of our problems would be solved if we just cleansed ourselves of those people. And of course, this is the kind of narrative that leads to ethnic cleansing, ethnic purifying. Sorry for those little balloons going there. Not the right place for those to show up. Um, but and when you study genocide across history, again and again, the people who commit the genocide use the language of cleansing. In Rwanda, the Tutsi minority justified the slaughter of the Hutu majority by saying they were like cockroaches, or they were like tall trees that won't let any light down to the rest of us. So the idea was the only way we'll be safe is to kill them. And that's the purification narrative. Sometimes you can't kill them, so you just are prejudiced against them, or you pass laws against them. And again, if this sounds familiar, we see this happening, everywhere, and
Yeah.
certainly in our country. So you have domination, revolution, purification. Whenever that happens, the people who are being oppressed, um, if they feel there's no hope for them, many of them try to escape. And that's the fourth narrative. We'll call it the isolation narrative. And they either say, let's head out into the wilderness, let's head out into the country and form a commune there, or let's cluster together in this part of town or in these states. So this isolation narrative says the only way for us to be safe is to create an isolated enclave of people like us. And of course, a lot of American history has people escaping from other places who come to the United States and want to create a little enclave
Mhm.
of safety, and it's understandable. So domination, revolution, purification, isolation. Now, and by the way, in the Gospels, when I was seeing this, John the Baptist, all I think biblical scholars today associate him with a group who's not explicitly mentioned in the New Testament, but we know a lot about from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other historical data, and that's the Essenes. And they're like the classic example of an isolation
Hmm.
narrative.
Hmm.
And so then a fifth story. There are people who just say, look, you can't be safe in this world unless you have a lot of money and a lot of land. And so what they focus on is just accumulate as much money and land and also weapons as you possibly can. And that's what we'll call the accumulation narrative. And in the Gospels, you realize whenever Jesus tells a story about Judeans, in Jesus' day, Judeans down in the south were near the capital city. That's where all the money was. That's where all the Roman money was and where the rich Judeans were. And then what they did is they bought land in the north, in Galilee, and they were displacing lots of farmers and farm workers and situations remarkably similar to what's happened in the United States in the last 120, 140 years, and happens in many other places. So these wealthy people get a larger and larger percentage of the wealth around, and they do this not because they need it, they can even use it all, but it's their attempt to create a huge a bubble of safety around them with land, with money, investments, and often weapons. So now we have five: domination, revolution, purification, isolation, accumulation. And then what about the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid and they're being exploited and they can't isolate and they can't accumulate? They have no options. And these are the people in the Gospels like the day laborers. You know, have you ever thought when Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, how did thousands of people come to hear him? Well, many of them were unemployed because of the bad economy, the unjust economy, and they had their lands taken away through corrupt kind of taxation and deals with rich people who exploited taxation. And so these are the poor Galileans, and these are the poor and the sick and the people who have they're just at the mercy of the current system. And I call that the victimization narrative. And the victimization narrative says there's nothing we can do. We're victims. We're hopeless. There's nothing we can do. The best we can do is be sure to tell the story of how badly we're being treated.
Mm.
And interestingly, when I had those six stories and I looked at Jesus, Jesus spends an awful lot of time with the victims. He spends a lot of time in Galilee among the poor and the sick and the people with disabilities and so on, who are truly at the mercy. They're vulnerable. He spends time with them, and he builds their faith that there's something that they can do. They're not hopeless. And he confronts these different groups, and he tells stories to expose these different groups. So those six stories help me understand so much about Jesus. And then finally, the seventh, against that backdrop, when I hear Jesus saying, here's the good news. If you just will believe this good news, that the kingdom of God is at hand, the civilization of God is within reach. The new arrangement is available to everyone now if you'll just have the faith to believe it. There's a better way to live and it's available. And when I understood that as a counter story, a counter narrative to the other six stories, all I can say is it's just made everything in my Christian faith make more sense.
Yeah. Well, that's why it felt so important to me when I heard you describe all of this. Because I mean, how many times have we read the gospel stories, right? I mean,
Yes.
your eyes glaze over. But then
Yeah.
if you look at it in that kind of context and depth that you just described and see what really was going on, what really Jesus was trying to do, the points he was trying to make. And it's just really opens a new vista for me.
Can I just give one quick example?
Sure, sure.
There's a story in the Gospels, and I remember when I would have to preach about this as a pastor. It troubled me. It's called the parable of the unjust steward, and it's about this steward who, a rich a rich Judean in the South sends a steward, which is a financial representative to the North, to extort money out of people. Or to take money from those people as part of this whole unjust system that's moving people from being small farmers to landless day laborers, or tenant farmers who eventually become landless day laborers. I mean, it's a miserable economic system, and we've seen different versions of it all through history. And so he has to go get money. And Jesus tells this parable. He doesn't call him unjust. He calls him clever. And what the steward does is he realizes that he's been cooking the books and he's been crooked. And so he realizes he's going to lose his job. And so he goes to the people he's been exploiting, and he says, look, I will cancel your debt to my master if you'll just pay a smaller amount. What he does is he in a sense switches his loyalty from the rich guy to the poor people who he's been exploiting. And Jesus' commentary on it is that he realizes that if he's good to those poor people, when he's lost his job, they'll be good to him. And in a way, when you look at the parable that way, it's Jesus' way of saying to all the sort of middle class people who are playing the system, he's saying, look, stop being loyal to those who you are kind of sucking up to for their wealth. Start being loyal to the people who are being hurt in this situation. I don't know. For me, suddenly that parable makes so much more sense. Especially you look at that parable in light of what comes before and what's after, and it just, it makes a lot of sense.
Wow. So one of the things you say in the book in regard to the seventh story is it's a story which some of us know that our purpose is not merely ourselves, but all of us.
Yes.
And, at the end of the day, that's kind of the key, right? Is making this mental shift like that.
Yes.
I hate to ask this, but how do we get more people to do that?
Yes. Well, and obviously, my book, Life After Doom, this is the same story that we need. Not only thinking about that my well-being is connected to the well-being of all people, but then I realize my well-being is connected to the well-being of coral reefs and rainforests and fungal communities in the soil of forests that, and plankton floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that we literally are connected. Thomas Merton used a term quite often he called the false self. And he contrasted it with the true self. And a lot of people have tried to understand what did he really mean by that. And I think he meant many things, but I think one of the very best synonyms for that term, the false self, is the disconnected self, or the isolated self, or the self-interested self. And the true self is the connected self, the self in solidarity, the self that understands, as Thomas Merton says elsewhere, understands ourselves as participating in a cosmic dance, and that we're part of something bigger. And it's funny. I mean, not funny. It's tragic and maybe funny too. But reality is trying to teach us humans that as individuals, we have to grow into a bigger story. And as a species, we have to grow into a bigger story.
And we're in the midst of learning it the hard way, as you point out.
And coming back to your question, how can we help more people get there? Well, it would sure be nice if the Christian religion decided to pick up this message of Jesus.
What a concept.
Yes.
So in the book, you devote a portion discussing the work of Rene Girard, which, I was only aware of the last, few years when I've read, a couple of different books about this mimetic, theory. So in describing, his theory, you talk about how human societies often use violence to stop violence.
Yes.
So could you explain that a little bit further?
Yes. So this is such a profound insight from Rene Girard. Um, I'm not going to use Girard's exact words, but I'm going to try to contextualize what he's saying. Um, we might say there are two main domains of conflict in the world. Uh, and that conflict can be emotional, verbal, political, economic. It can also be violent. It can be a matter of weapons and killing and harm. One is conflict and violence within our in-group, and one is conflict and violence involving an out-group, right? So the domination and revolution stories are about the out-group. Those other people who are ruling us, we're going to get back. Or those unruly people who won't submit to us, we're going to crush them. So out-group violence is a big deal. But what Rene Girard, as an anthropologist and a literary scholar and just an all-around brilliant dude, he started paying attention to in-group violence. And he suggested that our deepest anxiety is not from our enemies. Our deepest anxiety is from relating to our friends, the people who we trust. Now, in the middle of a war, obviously, we're really focused on our enemies. But in all the time between war, here's what Rene Girard said. At every moment, my well-being depends on my neighbors, my brothers, my sisters, my friends, my associates. And I depend on them and they depend on me. But in the back of my mind, because they're close to me and they know me, I'm always afraid that my neighbor will become my rival. And there are reasons he explored this. He really got focused on something that psychologists have been studying ever since. He called it mimetic theory. And the idea is that desire is contagious. Whatever you want, when I see you want it, something in me can want the same thing. And it turns us from being friends into rivals. So when we're constantly afraid of our associates being our rivals, he wants my girlfriend. He wants my job. She wants my status. She wants to knock me down a notch so she can climb a notch. This constant fear of rivalry, he believed, created anxiety. And when anxiety grows, anxiety among the in-group grows to a sufficient level, we need some way to purge our anxiety. By the way, this is why I think one of the reasons why Jesus taught so much about forgiveness, because what forgiveness does is forgiveness says, let's let go of our animosity. Let's let go of our hostility. Let's let go of the debts that we think we owe each other. Let's get back to a level playing field. And when that becomes a spiritual practice and a habit and a virtue, then you naturally bring down the
lowers the anxiety level.
Exactly. But if we don't know how to do that, our anxiety grows and grows. And one of two things happens. One thing we may do to unite ourselves is we'll go to war against somebody else. And then we're united for a short time until that war is over. And then our internal in-group anxieties increase. The other way we do it is among us, we choose some individual or group to scapegoat. And this brings us back to the purification narrative that we talked about before. And we, in a sense, all begin to pick on this group. We all develop unity over here by turning this individual or this group over here into our common enemy. So a few years ago, while there was this resurgence of white supremacy and this awareness of young Black men and women being killed by law enforcement and being treated unfairly by courts. What did white people do? But they created an imaginary enemy. They called it Antifa. Antifa, turns out, was a tiny group of a few hundred people. But if you had watched several cable news stations, you would have thought that Antifa was thousands and thousands of people ready to storm the Capitol, which somebody turns out did, but it wasn't Antifa. But they needed an imaginary enemy to inflate into a great danger so that they could unite themselves
Mm,
in some way. And
mm.
so this was one of Rene Girard's many fascinating insights that it's having huge impacts in biblical studies, because it's helping us see some of the dynamics going on in many biblical stories, but also in psychology and sociology and politics until today.
Wow. Wow. So, as you know, I always want to ask the question, so what do we do about it?
Yes.
Right? And you, in the book, you have kind of a two-part solution. Number one, to unmask the deceptive power of violence. And number two, to explore the regenerative power of a seventh story, a story of liberation,
Yes.
reconciliation, creativity, and peace. So obviously your book, is one attempt at doing that. What else do you see going on in the world
Yes.
that's helping either unmask or restore a regenerative story?
Yes. Well, let me just say, this is another place where it's been so fascinating to have Gareth Higgins as a friend, because Gareth is deeply interested in film. He's written books about film.
Yeah.
And if we were to take those seven stories, Gareth could tell you, here's a movie that's the domination story. Here's a movie that's the revolution story. He could, and here are movies that are the seventh story of reconciliation and connection and solidarity and harmony. And so a couple of years ago, Gareth worked through some of his contacts, and we went to the home of a very well-known Hollywood actor and producer, and I won't mention any names here, but who invited over a bunch of his friends who are also actors, producers, script writers, and invited us to present on the seven stories
You're kidding. Oh my
and
goodness.
and to in a sense try to encourage them to
Huh.
think, how could you tell stories that invite us into something larger?
Hmm.
And this is a huge work that remains for us to be done. But I'll mention one other thing, that in writing the book, and so I think, yeah, now this is no surprise. I mean, some people might say, yeah, this guy's never really graduated from being an English major. But I think one of the things we really should do is help people develop story literacy, um, to develop sensitivity to the stories that are at work in politics and economics and in our own family systems and in our own life. What story is dominating me right now? And and for us to help children develop story literacy. Um, Once you start to see how these stories are at work, you think, how did I get to be this old without thinking in these ways, you know?
Yeah.
So I think interestingly, this seems to me to be maybe one of the reasons why a book like the Bible becomes important, because by telling stories, it's trying to teach us story literacy. But what we did is we took out the stories and replaced them with doctrines. And we made it sound like the purpose of the Bible is to teach certain abstract statements or doctrines, that I think, looking back, are actually tools of a domination story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we
Yeah.
need to recover. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to Jews and Christians who work from the Bible. Muslims can do this with their stories. Hindus can do this with their stories. Buddhists can do this. Sikhs and others can do this. And secular people can do it, and atheists, agnostics. But here's where it becomes really powerful. When we use a story literacy, not just to critique other people, but to critique ourselves and our in-group.
Hmm.
That's where I think the change can start to happen.
Wow. Well, you say story literacy, but it's kind of like it's an uncovering what's the real motivation underneath
Yeah.
something.
Yeah,
For me, that's the way I interpret what you're saying.
that's
Is trying
right.
to watch
Yes.
out, every day, right, to see what's going on and say, okay, what's really going on here? It may appear in the news as XYZ, but underneath it is probably one of these stories.
Yes. In fact, it's haunting how far-reaching it is, when you develop even a beginning of sensitivity to this, you start saying, oh, this is just an attempt to dominate. Oh,
Yeah.
this is a revolution attempt. This person, this group thinks if they could just get those people out of power and then they take power, it would solve the problem. But they don't understand. They're working by the same deeper narrative, you know? So yeah,
Yeah, same thing
it's
with
flourishing.
scapegoating and victimization and,
And
accumulation. It's like,
and when people see how those six stories work and they realize that they all in a sense feed into one another and they take us places we don't really want to go.
really,
Um, at that point, that's when people are ready to repent, rethink, and say, gosh, none of my main stories are working. I need some new story. And I'm an absolute beginner at thinking about that new story. Uh, and that's an exciting time for a new beginning.
So the book also mentions the Global Nonviolent Action Database at Swarthmore College. What exactly
Yes.
is that?
So people have been studying nonviolent resistance, which is a key element, I think, of the seventh story. How do we bring about change without the tools of domination, revolution, and so on? Uh, and uh, and there is this growing database about the efficacy of nonviolent action. It's not a guarantee. It's not a silver bullet. But when you look at the long-term costs of violence, so for example, Vladimir Putin thought that he would solve a whole bunch of his problems by invading Ukraine. Um, and odds are he's going to find out that the consequences of invading Ukraine are going to cost him far more than he ever could have benefited, and they're going to last far beyond him. And he might never care about those longer term costs, but the people who future generations who look at those long term costs, if we paid attention to the long term costs of violence, um, we would start to understand, violence looks like it solves problems. It creates so many more problems. And uh, I can't remember where I heard this story, but um, just as an example of this, I heard someone who had once sat at a meal that where Saddam Hussein presided, and he said that Saddam said something like, "Those people are fools. They don't understand that when somebody gets in your way, when somebody resists you, when somebody goes against you, you don't just kill them. You kill their wife and their children and their uncles and their aunts and their cousins." It was this brutal statement of Saddam Hussein, as if to say that the only way to win by violence is to have even greater violence. You have to kill everybody, because if you kill one person, all of his relatives will hate you and try to kill you. You have to kill them. Well, of course, when you think about that, it didn't turn out so well for Saddam. But you also realize that our choices very often we just think, oh, we're just going in a little bit of violence, but you're going to have to keep doubling down. It's the same with lies. It's the same with greed. It's the same with
Mhm.
cheating. You have to keep doubling down, and it takes you farther and farther down that path. And so this nonviolent database is looking at cases where nonviolent action has produced lasting positive results.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's talk about just the practicality of this a little bit. The book is only available as an ebook. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. At this point, it's only available as an ebook.
Can we get a publisher to, start printing some copies of it for us?
That'd be nice. That'd be nice. If someone's interested, they can contact Gareth and we'll be glad to oblige.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
So I realize you've been really busy with your book launch of Life After Doom, but is there anything in terms of future plans that you're able to tell us about?
Well, Brian, I'm not telling many people about this, but I might as well tell you because you're a friend. But my next book will actually be a science fiction book that will come out next summer.
Oh, wow.
And I've been working on a science fiction trilogy for 6 years as sort of, for me, because I love to write. My nonfiction has felt like my work, and this fiction has felt like play. So that will come out next year.
Oh, wow. Well, that'll be exciting. What a change in focus, but I'm sure it'll be excellent.
I hope people will have fun with it.
Well, somebody, I hope, twist your arms to do some more, serious nonfiction after that.
Well, I have my project after that I'm contracted for is called The Beautiful Logic of a Meaningful Life.
Huh.
And it's a book trying to help people think about what a meaningful life is.
Awesome. Well, find your next calling. That'll fit right into
That's right,
my theme,
exactly.
there.
I'll have to set up a time to interview you for a change and hear what you're thinking about what makes a meaningful calling, because I'm thinking a lot about what's the meaning of meaning. What do we
Good.
mean
Well,
when
I
we say
did do a
meaningful?
little bit of research, my modest amount compared to your in-depth look at all these different
I'd love to hear
topics.
that. I'd love.
But
We'll talk about that sometime.
yes, yes. Well, Brian, thank you so much for all of your incredible work that's been so helpful to me and to, millions of other people. It's just incredible, your power of words and your prophecy, literally. So thank you so much for all of that.
Thanks. And thanks for your beautiful work. And it's a pleasure to be a friend and colleague in this work in this time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So remember, the title of the book is The Seventh Story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence. Please go check it out and download a copy at brianmclaren.net. Brian, thank you again.
Thanks. Great to be with you.